And so you basically, I want you to take this from memory. I don't want you to have your Bible open and your notes open when you take it. But I don't mind you looking at the test ahead of time to study. So you can look at it, you'll know what all the questions are. But when you take it, I need you to take it from memory. Does that make sense? So don't write all your notes on here and then take it. Just take a clean copy of it and then take it. You guys with me on that? All right. The test has 3 parts. There's 12 definitions, which you can answer in about a sentence. There are 13 matching, where you're asked to match a scriptural address in the right column with a concept in the left column. And then there are 5 essay questions that you can answer in about a paragraph. And if you wanted to, you could answer on this page, and if there's not enough room, you can attach a page. Okay. So here we go. All right, so here are the definitions. Number 1, you need to be able to define evolution. Now, your test is covering man and sin, right? So you need to define evolution. And you'll recall that we use this definition here. And you don't have to spit back this whole thing word for word, but you just need to show me you understand what evolution is. So you recall that. We talked about that, right? Well, I need to say something like one species changes into another over a long period of time through a process called survival of the fittest or something like that. I mean, basically you have to convince me you know what this means. And by the way, I'm not asking if it's a good or bad thing. I'm just asking, do you know what it is? All right, you need to define theistic evolution. You recall what that is? Yeah, that God guided the process of evolution. You don't have to tell me it's bad or good. I mean, I would think most of you would think it's a bad idea, but just show me that you know what it is. You need to define the term ex nihilo. Remember we talked about that? What is ex nihilo? Yeah, something out of nothing. That's the way we describe God's work in creation. And then you need to tell me now this is what we just spent the last hour and a half on, the 2 natures of the believer. So how would you define those?
Sin nature.
What's that?
Pre-conversion, post-conversion.
Well, I'd probably need to say more than that. You know, you have an old nature at physical birth. You have a new nature at spiritual birth. But the old nature continues on, you know, although you're not a slave to it. You need to be able to define, and there's the slide we were using for the 2 natures of the believer, but you need to define the gap theory. So the gap theory is basically you have the original creation in verse 1, and then you have the fall of Satan in between verse 1 and verse 2. And then verse 2 is a description of the chaotic conditions of the world. And then beginning in verse 3 is a restoration of what was broken. You need to define the day-age theory. Remember the day-age theory? What is that?
That one day is an age. That creation did not happen as a literal 7-day period.
Yeah. So each creation day is not a 24-hour period. It's like an age of time. Okay, you need to define the trichotomous view of man and the dichotomous view of man. Remember what those are? Trichotomy is man has how many parts? 3. And dichotomy is man has how many parts? 2. Okay. You need to be able to tell me what it means that man is an image bearer of God. Basically, the way I defined it in this class is we share in many of God's attributes, communicable attributes. And then you need to know what venial sins are. Who came up with that doctrine? Catholics. Those are lesser sins that don't lead to death in Roman Catholicism. Venial, yeah, it's a Latin expression. It's right there at the top, mortal versus venial. And then you need to know what the Traducian view of the soul is. You recall that? There it is. The parents are the primary creative agents in the origin of the soul. So it's the opposite of the original creationist view that says God performs a special work in every conception and puts a soul in that human being. But the Traducian view says the soul is passed on through parents to children. And then you need to define total depravity. So remember we talked about that? You know, it basically means every component of us has been touched by sin, and we can't do anything to merit God's favor. Although we are capable of doing good things in the eyes of our fellow man, and we're not as bad as we can be, but we just can't do anything to merit favor from God. Who was it? Was it you, Michael, that asked me about scriptures related to worship and giving? Yeah.
To worship by giving.
Yeah, right here. This is Cornelius giving alms to the Lord. And I think it talks in these verses. You might have to go to down into verses 4 or 5, but it talks about God received him as a worshipful offering. So, and then you can look at if you have a study Bible, you can look at the in the margin. It has some parallel passages usually. But yeah, giving is an act of worship. You might throw in there Hebrews 13, verse 17. Well, no, not. Well, I'm sorry. Scratch Hebrews 13, 17.
It's talking about God-pleasing sacrifices.
Where is that?
15.
13.
Sacrifice of praise.
Where do you see that?
Hebrews
Oh, yeah.
13,
Okay.
15. It's talking about sacrifice of praise, and it says, "Do not neglect to do good and sharing."
Oh, yeah. The Hebrews 13, 16. Yeah, you try that one too. Anyway, that's not related to the test. That's just something he asked me about. Okay, you have any questions on these 12 definitions? All right, the next section of the test is matching. And you're matching concept with verse. So you need a scriptural address for the following ideas. Earth, man as the center of divine activity. We talked about how, we're the centerpiece of what God is doing. And we used Romans 8, remember? The whole creation groans because of Adam's sin. You need a scriptural address for the fall of man. Where would we find the fall of man in the Bible? Genesis 3, that's your key passage. You need a scriptural address for the idea that the fall did not erase our image bearer status, but effaced it. So the third bullet point here will help you with that. We still are image bearers of God even though the fall has happened. And then you need, for people that believe in the trichotomous view of man, you need a scriptural address for that. So at the bottom of the screen, you might find some there that would be helpful. Now, remember we talked about the resurrection program. Each will be resurrected in his own order. And there's a Greek word there, tagma. And it's that's in 1 Corinthians 15:23. You need to know that address. And remember we worked our way through Genesis 3. You need a scriptural address for the proto-evangelium. What is the proto-evangelium? Anybody recall what that is? First gospel. So where is the first presentation of the gospel in the Bible? It's 3:15. It's the prophecy, but from the seed of the woman would come one who would crush the serpent's head. Okay. How about the first religious act in the Bible? Yes, sewing fig leaves together in Genesis 3:7. And then if I wanted to discover how sin entered the angelic world, what verses would I look at? Remember, we talked about Satan's fall. And these verses are the only verses we have that talk about how sin entered the angelic world. And then we talked about the three kinds of death, didn't we? Physical, spiritual, and eternal. You need a scriptural address for each of those. And that pretty much takes care of the matching. You have any questions on the matching or the definitions? 13 matching and 12 definitions. Yes. Remember we looked at those two verses, one in Isaiah 14, one's in Ezekiel 28. When we were talking about the origin of sin. All right, essay questions. Number 1. Name and describe 3 flaws associated with the theory of evolution. So in class, I believe it was our first class together, we walked through 6 flaws, didn't we? So I need you to commit 3 to memory and describe them. Now if you just name them but don't describe them, you get half credit. So I'm looking for an actual explanation. And then number 2, name and describe 5 differences between the theory of evolution and the creation account as given in the book of Genesis. So, name and describe 5 differences between the theory of evolution and the creation account as given in the book of Genesis. So remember, we spent a lot of time talking about why theistic evolution doesn't work. You know, we said evolution and the creation story are 2 different ideas going 2 different directions. So
You don't have to explain these. Just pretty much name them.
no, name and describe.
Name and describe.
Now, we had like 4 slides on this. So I'm just asking you to pick 5, commit them to memory, and tell me the differences. Okay, number 3. What are the differences between the Pelagian, semi-Pelagian, federal, and seminal views of imputation? So you recall we talked about imputation. We talked about how Adam's sin has been transferred to us. And the debate here is, how are we responsible for Adam's sin when we were not present in Eden? And so there are 4 views on it, right? The Pelagian view, the semi-Pelagian view, the federal view, and the seminal view. I mean, the Pelagian and semi-Pelagian are basically, Pelagius said we're innocent until we sin. Semi-Pelagian says we're not innocent, we're born with sinful tendencies, but we don't become accountable under Adam's sin until we make a choice to sin. Federal says we were not present in any sense when Adam sinned. So whatever choice was made, we inherited, whether we would have done differently or not. And seminal says we were actually there. I was actually there sinning along with him. Remember the Hebrews 7 passage about Levi tithed? When Abraham tithed, so did Levi, even though Levi was yet in Abraham's genes, Levi genes. It's easy to remember that. All right, number 4, give 5 ways God describes the lost. Now here you just have to give me a list. You don't have to write too much, but give 5 ways God describes the lost and give the scriptural address for each. So we talked about God's estimate of the lost in these 2 slides here. And you basically need to, give me 5 of these and with a list. Now, I'll tell you a real easy way to do it. If you just do Ephesians 2, 1 through 4, you've got 4 of them right there, all beginning with D. Dead, verse 1, demonically energized, verse 2, depraved, verse 3, doomed, verse 3. Okay, so far so good. And then the last question is, name 5 consequences associated with a believer continuing to yield to the sin nature.
5 consequences?
Yeah, now remember, this was what the lecture was in the first part of class, so this should all be fresh in your mind, hopefully. Name 5 consequences associated with the believer continuing to yield to the sin nature, and then give the scriptural address for each. Now, I'm not asking you to produce, like under premature death, there's like 4 or 5 verses. If you just gave me 1, that would be sufficient. So any questions on that?
So
Beg pardon?
how many consequences?
5.
5.
These are 5 questions, right?
Five essay questions. And here is your test. When you get it, make sure you've got 2 pages. On page 1, there should be front and back. And on page 2, there should be 1 page. And I know you guys are going to really hate me for this, but I'm going to let you go early today. Is that all right with you guys?